Thank you very much, Ishak, and it's a pleasure to be back here. I haven't been in Cairo since 2011, so it's a pleasure to be back taking part in this conference. Although, as Ishak said, these have not been easy years in the region for the topic that I deal with, which is the links between conflict and development. So the presentation that I am going to give this morning is really taken from global research on the links between conflict and development. I have put some additions to do with updates on figures from the region, and as I go through, I'll try to use some examples from other countries that have gone through conflict and have made successful transitions. The presentation will deal with trends in conflict, what we know about the causes and correlates of conflict, including development issues, the characteristics of successful transitions, a short interlude then to look at two topics which we didn't deal with when this work was done in 2011, the links to violent extremism and geopolitical shifts that have taken place in recent years. So starting with trends in conflict, the first thing to note about this is that there was a pause in the last 15 years from the mid-1990s where many people thought that global conflict in terms of large-scale civil war was largely a thing of the 20th century past. Conflict levels went down to very low levels worldwide. There was a sense that long-standing civil wars were being resolved, in South Sudan, for instance, where Ishak and I had worked together, and in many other areas of Africa. And there was a sense of a great deal of hope. That picture, of course, in the last 5 years has turned around enormously. So there has been a very significant uptick in the levels of conflict worldwide, most, although not all of it, driven by this region. So here we see on the right of this axis the number of conflict deaths in 2014. There are differing estimates, so I have given two here. But we've gone from an average level of around about 20,000 people dying in violent conflict per year to certainly over 125,000 people, more than 5 times that number, and according to some estimates, up to 180,000. A great deal of that is driven by the conflict in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, although there are other areas of the world, for instance, the atrocities that were carried out in the Central African Republic or the renewed fighting in South Sudan. This is particularly odd because this is a period where the world overall has made great progress in average development. So over this period, and even after the financial crisis of 2008, average incomes have continued to improve. So for any idea that there is a very direct linear relationship between conflict and development levels, this picture of the last 5 years, I think, does not show that at all. It shows, in fact, a disconnect between progress on development and progress on security. Then, going to what we know about some of the drivers of conflict, you can find quite good evidence for correlation between internal and external stresses on a country and conflict, and between factors that take place in the economic area, in the political area, and in the security area. I won't go through all of these, but just to say that part of the work that was done in the World Development Report looked at new information on correlates between, for example, institutional factors, such as corruption and human rights abuses, and conflict, and found very significant correlations. We also looked, somewhat unusually for work at the time, not only at factors internal to countries, but also at external stressors on countries. And there is, again, some reasonable evidence that there's a correlation between economic shocks, but also external stressors on the political and security arena, and the likelihood or the risk of conflict inside countries. And again, looking around the region, that mixture of internal stressors and external stressors, I think, comes out very strongly. I'm actually going on from the conference here to Beirut, and Lebanon clearly is a country at the moment that faces significant external stressors, not only those risks that come from inside its own society. But we found in this work that the real key to distinguishing why some countries fall into conflict and some don't was actually to do with institutions. And I think you can see this also intuitively by looking at the range of factors, just going back one, that we show here. Because of course there are many, many countries worldwide that have a mixture of some of these stressors, but not all of these countries fall into conflict. And the key really to that difference is in their institutional strength. So we found that institutional strength needed to be made up not only of capacity in institutions, but also their legitimacy and accountability. So the extent to which they commanded credibility among the population. We found that institutional indicators were very significantly linked not only with political violence but also with criminal violence. If you think, for instance, about the countries of Latin America who managed to resolve their civil wars but then fell into a situation of very high criminal violence, the institutional indicators were still linked. And we found on the accountability side that there was a very strong relationship between corruption or human rights abuses in the past and the risk of conflict in future. So we looked at lagged indicators of countries that had higher than normal levels of corruption or human rights abuse for their level of income, and found that their probability, their risk of conflict 5 years after that point was significantly higher than for countries that had more normal or more controllable indicators. So overall, the common challenge in looking at the risk of conflict, and again, I think when we look at developments around the region in the last 5 years, this still comes through, is a combination of external and internal stressors hitting societies whose institutions are too weak to be able to be resilient in the face of those stressors. We then looked at more than 70 case studies of countries that had made successful transitions out of conflict. So this included countries at quite low income levels, like Liberia or Sierra Leone or Timor-Leste. It also included countries at much higher income levels, like Chile or Argentina, Indonesia, South Africa, Northern Ireland, or Spain. And one of the things which came through from this was that none of these countries had actually made a linear progression from conflict and fragility to peace and development. All of them had gone through transitions which are shown in the spiral behind me, where they made some progress and then had some setbacks. Some progress, some setbacks. So that, in this sense, may be somewhat reassuring looking now around the region, since very clearly what we do see since 2011 is a great deal of setback with limited progress. But in fact, this is not absolutely unusual looking at the experience that has happened in other countries. In terms of what made some countries' transitions successful, we saw that what happened was that countries would go through a period of confidence building where they were generating a momentum in society that created confidence among citizens and also among particular stakeholder groups, whether political or in the private sector or in their international partners, and then would go through a later period of embedding that momentum in institutions. None of the countries that made successful transitions did so with grand plans of reforming every part of their society at once. They all did it through some combination of some actions to try to rebuild confidence and then some progress on transforming that into institutions. On confidence building, obviously the actions that work incredibly much depend on the country context, so you can't say that there is any prescription for it. But this slide gives some examples of what has worked. I would use here perhaps an example of South Africa during their transition. South Africa went through some very particular actions after the transformation from apartheid to try to restore confidence in the different stakeholders in society. And that included, for instance, making a set of appointments in the first post-apartheid government in 1994, which included people from the old regime, if we like, and also included people from what had been the opposition groups, who were, of course, by then in power. But they were very inclusive in their process of appointments. They also went through some quick actions to restore confidence among the population. And here it's notable that they didn't try to set up a process of delivering 40 or 60 or 80 results across every sector of the economy. They had 2 or 3 specific things in the first year of the transition that they focused on. In the case of South Africa, it was giving free access for pregnant women and children under 5 to healthcare, was one of their biggest promises. And they made sure that those were carried through and that you could actually see some improvement in the state institutions and in their relation to the citizens. They did use commitment mechanisms of different sorts. This can be important in countries that are coming out of conflict where there is deep mistrust in the society. So an example of a commitment mechanism would be agreement to have independent electoral monitoring, for instance, in a situation where the trust in domestic electoral institutions is low. For some countries, a commitment mechanism has included having international peacekeeping forces in place, where the trust in domestic security provision is very low. Going on to transforming institutions, again, I won't go through all the different aspects here, but just maybe to highlight some different paths. Countries almost always have followed a process of trying to show citizens and show some of the key stakeholder groups that it is possible to envision a different type of effective state action, and then have found ways to embed that relationship in their institutions in a more permanent way. But for me here, it is interesting, for instance, to contrast the paths taken by countries like Chile and Argentina, coming out of several decades of dictatorship, with a country like Indonesia, which also went through a transition in the late 1990s. In Chile and Argentina, for instance, they put a great deal of emphasis on some of the elements of this slide which deal with human rights abuses, accountability, political participation, and reform of the security forces. In Indonesia, by contrast, they actually made less rapid progress on those elements, and they focused very much on economic reforms, which gave a sense of confidence that institutions were really being reformed. And that applied even to different pathways for changing the role of the military in society. So in Indonesia, for example, the main pathway was economic. The military's budget was brought under much greater accountability. The military's involvement in private sector operations was gradually reduced. In Chile and Argentina, in fact, the military's involvement in economic issues continued for quite a long period, but there was much greater direct addressing of previous human rights abuses and accountability for those. The last point that it's worth making here is that these transformations take time. So we looked at the fastest 20 reformers in the 20th century, countries that had gone from having very weak institutions that were affected by conflict to having a, not perfect, but a very sound, robust level of institutions. And what we found was that for most indicators, the average was somewhere between 20 and 35 years, and the single fastest country to make those transitions had typically done it in round about 15 years. So this contrasts, of course, with the expectations that we often have. And I can relate this a little bit to the last time that I was visiting Cairo in 2011, where the expectations of people I spoke to at that time were that every aspect of society would be transformed. A year seemed like a very long time. People wanted to see transformations in 3 months or or 6 months. And in fact, this is not how institutional transformation has happened in the past. So even when we have timelines of 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, this is fast in comparison with previous performance. I'll stop, and just for the last part of the presentation, we'll give some initial thoughts on differences with violent extremism. So what I've just looked at relates to civil war, civil conflict, and countries emerging from that kind of relationship, as well as countries emerging from authoritarian regimes. Violent extremism is, I think, different, and the research on it is still, sadly, quite lacking. There is not a great body, for example, of quantitative research you can go to, which looks at documenting very well the correlates of violent extremism. There are also very contested definitions. So the tracking of people dying worldwide from conflict is fairly widely accepted, even if there are differences in range, whereas in violent extremism, there is no uncontested data on this. But what we do know about it, there is much less of a direct link to poverty. So in the case of conflict, both the absolute level of poverty and the speed at which countries are improving economic indicators helps decrease their vulnerability to conflict. It appears that for violent extremism, this is not the case. There's a possible link to exclusion and to institutions, but again, the research on this is not at the moment very compelling. We know that the education and class patterns of recruits are different. So recruits into violent extremism, very typically middle class and more educated than recruits into rebel group movements who fight against governments. And we know that there does appear to be quite a significant positive pull. So people are recruited into these movements not only because of push factors like unemployment or harassment in the countries they live, but also because some sense of community is being held out to them, which they recognize and are pulled by. Some of the areas that I think are very promising for research on this in the next period, but on which the research is not good, are trying to explore some of the disconnects in what has happened with our economic development in the past. And I'll just go through 3 of those. So one is between our ability to show inclusion in terms of employment. So this is a global slide, it's not specific to the region, but overall people are living longer and we are working less. The second is between average growth and inequality. In almost every region of the world, with the exception of Latin America, we've seen increases in inequality in the past period. And the third is between looking at connectivity and other measures of inclusion. And this, I think, would be very interesting to see more work on. But we have seen in the last 10 or 15 years an absolute exponential increase in young people's connectivity. So, of course, mobile phone subscriptions, access to the internet has gone through the roof. But that has been accompanied by a decrease in voter participation and a decrease in young people's ability to access the labor market in most regions. So in other words, we are providing mechanisms which help increase people's expectations because they have access to information they didn't previously have, but we are not then delivering mechanisms which actually make them feel that they have an ability to participate politically and economically in society. And I'll just finish also by some shifts in geopolitical conflict, which in my think tank we have been looking at recently. We looked at measures of economic power of some of the major powers and their shifts over the recent period. And of course, this is by no means a new thing. We all know that there has been a convergence in the economic power of some of the 20th century powers and the middle-income countries and emerging powers. But what I think is interesting is that this reaches something like a tipping point at the moment. So in previous decades, this was a relatively slow, steady movement. In the current period, it has become a tipping point where many of the emerging powers have overtaken the 20th century powers in their economic clout. Economic clout, of course, is not directly linked to diplomatic or security clout, but it's obviously a fairly good proxy for it. Again, this is by no means the first time in history that that kind of shift has taken place. This last slide goes back in time and looks at shifts in power over the past 4 centuries. And there was, of course, a very significant shift in power between China and India, and then the US, France, UK, etc. But what is notable about this is that periods in which there are large shifts of power of this sort have also been accompanied by quite a lot of tumult and conflict, because the balance in terms of geopolitics is shifting. So that means perhaps necessarily that what we are going through at the moment is going to be a fragile period. It's not going to be so easy to find international solutions or international consensus on what should be done. Let me stop there.